During the 5 grim years of World War II, all of the countries involved created an effective propaganda system that portrayed enemy soldiers as monsters who deserved nothing more than death. British, American, German, Russian, and Japanese army departments were tasked with creating a false reality where stereotypes, racism, and discrimination were used to humiliate the enemy and increase the hatred between adversaries. However, the reality of war was often different. On the Western Front, enemies were mostly treated with respect according to old laws of war. Although it may seem unlikely, acts of honor and soldier camaraderie depicting the ancient warrior ethos were no strange thing to the Second World War soldiers. Especially among Air Force pilots, mutual respect and acts of honor shared by aviators resembled the medieval acts of chivalry. A young 21-year-old USAF pilot, Charlie Brown, experienced firsthand the virtuous conduct exhibited by a Luftwaffe pilot during a bombing raid when his B-17 bomber was severely damaged and about to go down. After the German pilot, Franz Stigler, realized the American crew was defenseless, he took the dangerous decision of escorting the aircraft to safety across German-controlled territory. It was an almost unbelievable tale of 2 pilots that met each other as enemies in the skies of World War II, survived, and died as best friends and real Kameraden. In 1943, the bombing raids against German cities and military factories drastically increased as the German Luftwaffe was slowly but steadily outnumbered by American and British aircraft's continuous production. German manufacturers could simply not keep up with production demands, and the air forces were thinly distributed against the various war fronts. Paired with a lack of manpower and the country's economic problems, the military knew that the war had to end soon, or the Reich would surely be defeated. Germany had a time bomb in its hands. The Allies adopted bombing raids to disrupt German supply networks and production depots to further slow German armament. The iconic B-17 Flying Fortresses were the frontline aircraft of all these missions. The American-made bomber was heavily equipped and could take a beating like no other warplane. Often flying in formation and escorted by fighters, B-17s dropped their payloads and then returned safely back to bases scattered across Europe. However, many of them fell victim to German AA guns' accurate fire. One cold night of December 1943, just 4 days before Christmas, the 527th Bombardment Squadron of the USAF's 8th Air Force was conducting a perilous mission above German skies. The target was the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft production facility. The squadron was expecting heavy resistance from the defenders, and that is what they precisely got. More than 200 German flak guns and hundreds of aircraft guarded the objective's area, waiting for the enemy to show up. One of the B-17s assigned to this mission was the Ye Old Pub, commanded by rookie 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charles L. Charlie Brown, who had lied about his age to command more respect among his peers. Brown's Ye Old Pub was to fly at the edge of the formation, better known as the Purple Heart Corner, an infamous spot commonly targeted by German AA guns. The crew's bombing run began at 27,300 feet, with a freezing cold temperature of roughly minus 60 degrees. As the aircraft approached its target, accurate enemy fire hit its nose, destroyed the second engine, and severely damaged the fourth one. The hits dramatically slowed the Ye Old Pub, making it fall back into the formation as a straggler, where it was quickly attacked again by sustained enemy surface fire. Then, more than a dozen of enemy Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s began harassing the rear guard of the formation, including Brown's aircraft. Almost 10 minutes later, the aircraft's third engine was damaged. It was now only at 40% of its power capacity. The tail section was shot to pieces, and the entire electrical, hydraulic, and oxygen systems were at critical levels. The fuselage was torn apart. The entrails of the battered bomber flapped like windows left open during a storm. The tail gunner could not do anything against the German Predator's overwhelming force and eventually received a fatal direct hit. The rest of the guns were quickly rendered useless as they began to freeze due to the extreme temperatures above 25,000 feet. Of the 11 machine guns available, only 2 dorsal turrets were functional, and they quickly ran out of ammo. Most of the crew was wounded by shrapnel and cannon shells. To make matters worse, with the fuselage exposed, the morphine syrettes to ease their pain froze. Lieutenant Brown, hurt in the shoulder, freezing slowly and bleeding from his wound, blacked out for a few seconds. The Ye Old Pub immediately started to dive down dangerously. The enemy fighters thought that was the end of the B-17 and made a quick turn back to base. Brown's blackout unexpectedly saved the crew's life. When he woke up, the B-17 was just 100 feet from hitting the ground. Brown miraculously controlled the aircraft and headed back to England's safety, from where his formation came. But as the ye old pub turned to go back to base, the crew heard the terrifying noise of a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 approaching from behind. Franz Stigler, a German ace pilot in his 20s with 27 registered victories, spotted the damaged B-17 as it passed his station. He quickly hopped into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 to hunt it down, which would get him closer to earning a precious Knight's Cross medal. Like most German soldiers and aviators stationed in the motherland, Stigler was driven by a sense of duty to his people, who were indiscriminately bombed by Allied bombing raids. He had seen what had happened to cities like Hamburg and Bremen, which had been bombed to the ground. Stigler had lost his only brother, a pilot like him, in August of that year at the hands of the USAF fighters. Earning the Knight's Cross represented the love Stigler had for his country and his people. With all that in mind, he rose to the skies to take down the American B-17. As Stigler approached the enemy bomber, he decided to attack it from the rear. He climbed behind it and was about to pull the trigger when he noticed something that troubled him. Despite being within its range, no defense fire was coming from the bomber. For Lieutenant Brown and his crew, it seemed like it was their end. They were defenseless against the German fighter. They watched helplessly as it made another pass around them, as if to humiliate them before taking them down. But the opposite happened. As Stigler made his pass, he noticed the battered state of the aircraft. He saw the fuselage was torn apart and the injured crew members inside. When he saw Lieutenant Brown's face, he perceived the fear in his eyes, and he felt pity. The pilot could not take them down. It was not a fair fight. To the German, it was not honorable taking out the life of a beaten enemy. He immediately remembered the words of one of his commanding officers from his campaign in North Africa, who once told the pilots, quote, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." For Stigler, a man of faith who had even studied to be a priest when he was young, it was unthinkable to shoot them or leave them to their fate. The only way out was to help them, even if there was a risk that he could get reported and court-martialed. Twice, Stigler tried to get Brown to land his plane and surrender. As he got closer to the B-17's nose, he signaled Brown to land. But Brown and his crew, baffled, could not understand what Stigler was trying to tell them with his gestures. As a last resort, Stigler opted to escort them to the sea. To prevent German AA guns from taking down the B-17, Stigler flew at its side in formation. Brown and his crew, astonished and unsure, could not believe what the German fighter was doing. It was not until they reached open waters that the American crew realized that Stigler had escorted them safely out of harm's way. He approached the destroyed B-17's nose, looked at Brown, saluted him, and then flew away. The ye old pub arrived in terrible conditions at Cambridgeshire, with all the crew alive except the tail gunner. They were a living miracle that proved the toughness of B-17s. At the debriefing, Lieutenant Brown told his officers that he was alive thanks to the German aircraft that escorted his crew. The High Command, alarmed that word might get out about the honor and respect shown by a German pilot, decided to keep it secret. Brown would later say, quote, "Someone decided you can't be human and be flying in a German cockpit." As for Stigler, he never told anyone about what he did, and he kept flying until the end of the war. After the conflict, both men continued with their lives as usual. They carried on with their lives, and the war memories began to slowly fade away. Except for one. Brown returned to the US to study and continue serving in the USAF, while Stigler migrated to Canada in 1953 and became a businessman. In 1986, Brown was asked at a combat pilot reunion about any memorable experiences of his service. He recalled the time a German pilot saved his crew's lives. After the talk, he decided that it was time to find out what had happened to that German pilot. After 4 years of searching, he received a letter from Stigler himself, in which he announced, quote, "I was the one." After speaking to each other over the phone, they decided to meet. Strangely enough, both men felt an instant connection, as if they were brothers that had not seen each other in a long time. The warrior bond had united them. Between 1990 and 2008, both pilots became close friends, visiting each other and talking often. Stigler lived in Vancouver and Brown in Seattle. For a long time, they had unknowingly been living close to each other. Their tale is an example of the honor and respect that embodies the warrior ethos. More often than not, the hatred between governments and officials is quite different from the respect that the common soldier, the grunt, shares for his former enemy. In one of the many aviation books Stigler gave to Brown, he wrote, quote, "In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December, 4 days before Christmas, I had the chance to save a B-17 from her destruction, a plane so badly damaged it was a wonder that she was still flying. That pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was." SS Obergruppenführer Dr. Hans Kammler was one of the most influential leaders of Nazi Germany. Imposing, ingenious, and rampantly power-hungry, he was one of the architects behind the Nazi concentration camps, director of the top-secret V-2 rocket initiative, and the master of Germany's late-war emergency fighter programs. A shrewd and calculating SS commander consolidated massive power as the Nazi regime crumbled into pieces around him. And even Hitler's chief architect, Albert Speer, called him, quote, "Hitler's most brutal and most ruthless henchman." But just as his power and ambition reached their zenith in the latter years of the war, the Machiavellian SS commander mysteriously disappeared from the face of the earth. Conflicting reports as to his whereabouts emerged across the lands. Some claimed he had fallen in battle, while others affirmed he had taken a cyanide pill along with his wife. She later denied it, raising concerns of a possible escape or secret negotiation with the Allies. However, there were also those who claimed the man made it to the United States, where he reportedly met a fate much worse than cyanide. Hans Kammler started his career as an aspiring engineer, eager to leave his mark on a struggling German nation. From his youth, he was an exceedingly patriotic man who had missed the opportunity to serve during World War I. In 1919, he joined the Rossbach Freikorps, one of many private right-wing paramilitary factions that sprung up after the war. As part of the militant group, Kammler participated in the brutal fight against German communist blocs for control in the unstable Weimar Republic. He then enthusiastically joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS 2 years later. Charismatic and well-educated, Kammler quickly climbed the hierarchy ladder and rose from head of the building department to deputy chief of the SS's main economic and administration office. In his new position, he oversaw the financial supply and the business projects for the SS state, and the construction and operation of the many concentration camps built across the Reich. As the man in charge, he was quick to suggest a new and harrowing solution to manage the camp's populations, overseeing the construction of crematorium buildings. His work eventually led him to participate in the secret weapons programs of the Third Reich, where he was tasked with constructing remote underground facilities where the newest Nazi Wunderwaffe would be developed and produced. Then, in 1942, he began overseeing production plants and test facilities for the V-2 rocket and the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet. Resolute and wholly dedicated to his work, he was soon promoted to operation and weapon development. The V-1 and V-2 rocket development facilities were built in underground facilities connected to concentration camps, from where Kammler could tap into an unending source of slave labor. The general showed no mercy for his prisoners and often worked them to their demise. When it was suggested to him to improve the conditions of the workers, he would notoriously say, quote, "Don't worry about the victims. The work must proceed ahead in the shortest time possible." As Kammler became increasingly more crucial in the Nazi efforts, he was forced to operate under Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer appointed Kammler as his representative for particular construction tasks and considered him an ally. However, Kammler didn't like receiving orders from Speer and wanted his post and authority above all else. After working under Speer for close to a year, Kammler persuaded Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, to appoint him the director of special buildings under the fighter aircraft program. The move completely undermined Speer's authority and position, even more so as the war approached its final stage. By then, Hitler had become more desperate and reckless, and the extensive power hierarchy of the Third Reich began to collapse and centralize into fewer individuals. After persuading Hitler to transfer the V-2 program to the SS, Heinrich Himmler appointed Kammler to lead the missile operations, and he soon launched the V-2 campaign against the Allies. Then, on January 31, 1945, Hitler appointed Kammler as the head of all missile projects. However, the shortage of explosives had reached a critical level, and the program was slowly shutting down. Hitler then transferred aircraft support, maintenance, and supply duties from Hermann Göring to Kammler, making him the Führer's general plenipotentiary for jet aircraft in early April. In just a few months, Kammler had become one of the most powerful commanders in the decaying Nazi regime. As the Wehrmacht structure began to collapse before the unrelenting advance of the Allied forces in the east and the west, the pressure took its toll on Kammler, who became even more ruthless and despicable. In late March of 1945, he ordered his men to execute over 200 workers after his car was held up on a busy road in the Sauerland and he suspected foul play. As Germany became increasingly engulfed by chaos, Kammler began to move from one place to another, fleeing from Allied spies and troops, and from his superiors, whose orders he often disobeyed. Throughout the ordeal, Kammler desperately tried to move his missile program to different locations, but his personal forces were eventually ordered to join the German infantry. An erratic Kammler then began disregarding direct orders, abandoning the Nordhausen facility, and sending the valuable scientists and technicians into hiding as he disappeared. Even so, thanks to highly disputed British records stemming from Operation Little Foxley, which actively sought to assassinate him, historians could get a glimpse at the SS commander's last days in Germany. In April of 1945, Kammler and his staff were targeted for assassination, but managed to survive the massive Royal Air Force airstrikes that took the lives of 8,600 people in the Nordhausen area. Kammler and his team drove to safety, and on the 13th, he was reportedly in Munich for a meeting with Albert Speer. It is said that Kammler and his staff then arrived at the Linderhof Palace, near an extensive underground SS lair and the Messerschmitt 262 jet aircraft factory in Oberammergau. While there, they reportedly hid tons of research documents and swiftly moved to avoid the British commandos hunting them. The group is said to have moved again on April 28th to Avon in Austria, where they were located near a concentration camp that had been using its prisoners to construct an underground armament storage facility. Then, on May 3rd and 4th, just 4 days before the final German surrender, Kammler and his staff set out for Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, which was still under German occupation. Kammler and his driver, Friedrich Baum, eventually separated from the main convoy, and his trail went cold from that point on. The British reported to have heard from Kammler one last time on May 7th, when he sent a message to his surviving SS group in hiding, but anything after that cannot be confirmed. The story goes that Kammler and Baum made it to Prague, but were caught up in the Czech uprising against the German occupation. It is said that Kammler was shot in the left knee, taken to the hospital, and then ended by Czech partisans when the hospital was overrun. However, records show that a senior army sergeant named Friederike Baum, who was of a similar grade and had a similar injury, was admitted to a military hospital in Komintern, Austria on May 23rd, after being shot in the knee in Prague on May 4th. Baum succumbed to an infection 6 days later. Some historians have speculated that Kammler changed into an army uniform and adopted Baum's identity, claiming that he had then attempted to escape the after-war chaos, but eventually succumbed to blood poisoning and was put to rest in a mass grave. Another story is that Kammler ended his life while on the run. Some of his cohorts initially declared that he had escaped to be with his wife in Ebensee, where both consumed cyanide tablets to end their lives. Other people working for the fugitive reported that Kammler and members of his staff left Prague on May 9th, after which he either shot or poisoned himself and was buried by his loyal team in an unmarked grave. However, in 1949, a U.S. counterintelligence corps agent working on denazification refuted this story, stating that Kammler had actually been captured by the Americans in May of 1945, but escaped shortly after and made his way to East Germany, where he began working for the Soviets. To this day, there is still much conjecture surrounding the fate of Kammler, including the possibility that he faked his own demise and was actually in secret custody with the Western Allies or the Soviets. Many analysts believe the entire Prague story was fabricated to provide a plausible scenario for his final fate in the soon-to-be Soviet occupation zone, where no proper investigation could ever be carried out. Moreover, the lack of urgency with which the Allies searched for Kammler immediately after the war led many to believe that they already had him in custody and didn't want the Soviets to know. Additionally, many historians find it rather suspicious that Kammler's name was not mentioned in the numerous Berg trials and the 35,000 pages of testimony and evidence it produced. Notably, the Allies seemed uninterested in hunting down the missing SS commander, going as far as complying with his wife's demand of declaring him officially deceased, even when there was no concrete evidence to support the claim. Another possible scenario was suggested by an OSS officer who claimed that Kammler was taken to the US and held captive until 1947. The disturbing report claims that the SS commander was brutally punished and tortured in a secret location, and that he was, quote, interned at a place of maximum security, with no hope, no mercy, and without seeing the light of day until he hanged himself. 2 reports from declassified US files seem to back this story, indicating that Kammler was in American custody as of May 30th, 1945, with one document listing him among senior German Air Force personnel. Kammler's capture is further documented in another file dated July 10th, 1945, as one of the prisoners being interrogated. Despite the evidence, the ultimate fate of Hans Kammler remains unknown, with many historians suggesting he committed suicide while in US custody in 1947, while others believe he ultimately evaded justice for his crimes. Hitler's Third Reich was rapidly crumbling before his very eyes. The vast empire that had once spanned from Tripoli to Rome to Kiev was now shrinking, drawing ever so close to Berlin. Also, Paris was still under Nazi control, but not for long. Allied forces were advancing through France, and the population in the City of Lights was ardently revolting against its Nazi occupiers. Hitler, by now a mere shell of the man he had been just a few years before, was visibly ill, vehemently paranoid, and was determined to turn Paris into dust before anyone else could have it. The dictator also had the perfect man in mind for such a grim task, and his name was Dietrich von Holtitz. A soldier from a military family who never questioned orders, von Holtitz was amply experienced with Germany's scorched earth policy, having razed several cities on the Eastern Front. As such, Hitler approved von Holtitz as the military governor of Paris, and on August 23rd, he received a terrifying order from the Führer, quote, Paris must not pass into the enemy's hands except as a field of ruins. The directive was clear. Von Holtitz had to bring down the Eiffel Tower, burn Notre Dame and the Invalides, blow up the 65 bridges of Paris, and turn its museums and palaces to rubble before withdrawing from the city. It is said that as the Allies surrounded the French capital and his men awaited orders to once again raise a city before fleeing, von Holtitz felt overwhelmed with remorse and decided to disobey an order for the first time in his life, even if it came directly from Adolf Hitler. General Dietrich von Holtitz had met Adolf Hitler once before, during a summer 1943 conference on the Russian front. They had spent time together among several high-ranking officers. Reportedly, the young aristocrat officer had been appalled by the dictator's lack of table manners during a meal, but was otherwise mesmerized by the formidable personality and contagious confidence the Führer displayed. Hence, von Holtitz was visibly ecstatic when the Führer personally summoned him a year later to be assigned an important task. The officer had reasons to expect good news. He was just arriving from 3 years of distinguished service on the Russian front. Von Holtitz came from a long lineage of Prussian military tradition. He had been bred to respect military hierarchy and value obedience overall. Along with his strategic wit, such traits brought him success, leading the German invasion force into Holland in the spring of 1940, where he commanded the bomber formations that pulverized Rotterdam before the city had a chance to surrender. Later, in the July 1942 siege of Sevastopol, von Holtitz's regiment was so devastated that he forced Russian prisoners of war to carry shells and load the guns being used against their brothers. He was severely wounded, but he clung to his life even when most other German soldiers in his unit perished. A year later, von Holtitz obediently enacted the Führer's scorched earth policy in the east, making sure that the advancing Soviets found nothing but smoldering rubble in the wake of the retreating Wehrmacht. For von Holtitz, his obedience and dedication were about to be rewarded. But in the Führer's eyes, the officer was a ruthless city burner, which was precisely what he needed for this operation. Von Holtitz would later reflect on the unfortunate circumstances that turned him into a destroyer of cities. Quote, "Since Sevastopol, it has been my fate to cover the retreat of our armies and destroy the cities behind them." As von Holtitz entered the Wolf's Lair on August 6th, he was suddenly confronted by a completely different Hitler to the one he fondly remembered. Renowned historian and biographer Jean Edward Smith described the dreadful encounter. Quote, "As soon as he saw the Fuhrer, von Holtitz realized the war was lost. Before him was, quote, an old, bent-over, flabby man with thinning gray hair, a trembling, physically demolished human being." Hitler was furious and nonsensical, constantly ranting about his generals and cursing the recent attempt on his life. The dictator spoke in abusive language while reportedly spitting froth out of his mouth, and drops of sweat trickled down his face while he spoke vigorously about the execution of the generals. Von Holtitz recalled, quote, "I saw in front of me someone who had lost his mind. The fact that the life of our nation was in the hands of an insane being who could no longer judge the situation or was unwilling to see it realistically depressed me immensely." The general emerged from that meeting as the new military governor of Paris, but the title meant little to him. It was clear that the war effort was hopeless, that Hitler was insane, and that his assignment was just yet another scorched earth task. A completely disillusioned von Holtitz boarded a train to Berlin to briefly see his wife, Uberta, his daughters Maria Angelica and Anna Barbara, and his infant son, Timo. While on the train, he had a chance encounter with SS Reichsleader Robert Ley, the German Workers' Front leader. Conversing over cigars, they traded news of their dealings of the past few days, and Ley told his comrade of a new law that had been issued by Hitler that very afternoon. The Sippenhaft law, inspired by the bomb plot on Hitler's life, essentially made hostages of the families of frontline soldiers and officers. If a German soldier deserted, committed treason, disobeyed, or simply performed poorly, his next of kin risked being executed by the Third Reich. The news pushed the already disheartened von Holtitz over the edge. The two recent meetings had completely thrown his world upside down, and his life of blind obedience suddenly felt so apparent and meaningless. When von Holtitz arrived in Paris to assume his new position, he quickly learned how dire and complex the situation in the city was. On the one hand, General Dwight Eisenhower's troops were drawing close to the town, and the liberation assault was expected to commence any day now. On the other hand, von Holtitz only had about 20,000 men at his disposal, and the approaching American troops were not his only problem. Paris was in violent turmoil. Communist rebels had risen up against the German occupiers, and they were unleashing a guerrilla campaign on the streets of Paris. To make matters worse, he and his group of loyalists were also rapidly gaining power and being pressured by the public to establish an independent government in the city. Unbeknownst to Paris's military governor, General Eisenhower debated whether to liberate Paris now or postpone the battle. Paris Mayor Pierre-Charles Taittinger was pressuring the general to act as soon as possible to avoid Paris falling into a communist regime, but the Allies knew that if they sent troops to Paris now, their overall liberation efforts in France would suffer a severe setback. The situation in the French capital was a ticking bomb, with a violent race to see which faction would seize power sooner, the Allies, the Communists, or the Gaullist forces. Von Holtitz stood amid this chaos, while constantly being pressured to raise the city. Then, on August 17th, the German general received an urgent telegraph from Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge that read, quote, "I give the order for the neutralization and destruction envisaged for Paris." German engineers had already started to prepare for the destruction of Paris, and many of the city's bridges had already been set up with explosives, while they had stored significant amounts of U-boat torpedoes in the underground tunnels that could be triggered when the order was given. Despite some historians' reports that von Holtitz didn't have the men and resources necessary to destroy the city, the Germans had already mined the cellar of Les Invalides with enough explosives to blow up the French Army Museum, as well as the military art gallery, 400-year-old barracks, and Napoleon Bonaparte's tomb. Furthermore, on August 23rd, 4 SS engineers inspected the supports of the Eiffel Tower, looking for the best spots to place charges. The plan was well in motion to destroy the City of Lights. All that was needed now was von Holtit's order. As Paris descended into madness and savagery, with communist rebels attacking more and more German soldiers, and the already dwindling Nazi troops being reassigned to the south of the city expecting the Allied incursion, von Holtitz found himself facing unbearable pressure to begin the destruction of Paris. Then, in a mind-blowing outburst, von Holtitz put his and his family's lives on the line by lying to the Chief of Staff of Army Group B, Henry Lieutenant Hans Speidel, and informing him that the city's devastation had already begun. As he spoke, the city's military governor secretly hoped that the Allies would liberate the city as soon as possible. Meanwhile, not wanting to leave the entirety of the task to von Holtitz, Hitler also ordered the Luftwaffe to bombard the city. However, von Holtitz fought back, commanding to halt the attack on the pretense that the raid would hit numerous German positions. The Allied top brass had hesitated for months whether to invade Paris or continue liberating the rest of France. Moving on to Paris meant saving it from the Nazi scorched earth policy, but at the cost of risking delaying the liberation of the rest of the country before the winter months. Still, as if you could hear von Holtitz's plea, General Eisenhower finally decided to liberate Paris, after continuous pressure from the city's mayor and Gaullist representatives who convinced him that the city would either be destroyed or fall to communist rebels if he didn't act now. The Allied troops then advanced practically unopposed through the weak German defenses, as the fewer than 20,000 demoralized men defending the city mostly surrendered at the sight of the American forces. While the Allied advance was taking place, von Holtitz did all he could to stall the city's destruction, and only a few bridges were blown up, with most landmarks remaining intact. U.S. forces soon entered the governor's office, where von Holtitz ceremonially surrendered to the Allies to be taken as a prisoner of war. Then, as he was taken out of the building, Allied soldiers had to protect him from being lynched by the furious Parisian mobs who had no idea what he had just done. Despite the colossal historical value of liberating Paris, Eisenhower's decision came at a high cost. Allied oil reserves had been exhausted, and the German forces that escaped reached the protection of the Siegfried Line. The Western Front would stagnate for several months as winter drew close, and there would be brutal carnage in Hürtgen Forest. Meanwhile, the British would be obliterated at Arnhem, followed by the Battle of the Bulge. What's more, innumerable innocent people would continue perishing in concentration camps while awaiting Allied liberation. It was a terrible price to pay to save one of the most important cities in Europe. Throughout the decades, many experts disputed von Holtitz's role as the so-called savior of Paris, stating that the man merely clung to the idea in order to save face, as the Third Reich crumbled into pieces, and adding that by the time he was given the order to go on with the attack, he had little resources left to execute the command. Still, other accounts describe many Parisian landmarks as already being rigged for detonation, and von Holtitz himself claimed to have saved the city till the day he passed. Quote, "If for this first time I disobeyed an order, it was because I knew Hitler was crazy." As World War II began, Germany hatched one of its most devious and notorious plots to bring Britain to its knees. Instead of bombing the country with the power of explosives, Germany would bomb its enemy with money. Operation Bernhardt began forging British banknotes of such quality that one Bank of England official called them, quote, "the most dangerous ever seen." The intent was to collapse the British economy and sow chaos by showering its citizens with free money falling from the sky. The unit in charge of replicating the money successfully duplicated the rag paper used by the British, engraving near-identical blocks. The Germans also cracked the algorithm that gave each banknote its alphanumeric serial code. It was only through the capture and interrogation of German intelligence leader Alfred Naujoks that the plot was eventually foiled. The British pound wasn't the hardest currency to forge, but it wasn't the easiest. The designs used during the war period had been introduced in 1855 and had only slightly changed since then. The bills were printed on white rag paper, primarily made of cotton. On the top left-hand corner, one side showed black printing and an engraving of Britannia, the personification of the United Kingdom, as designed by Daniel Maclise from the Royal Academy of Arts. Although the £5 note was smaller, the 10, 20, and £50 were all the same size. However, as a security measure, the notes also featured almost 150 minor marks, changed between issues and often mistaken as printing errors. To ensure they each were real, the notes had alphanumeric serial numbers. They were also signed by the Bank of England's chief cashier. Before notes were released by the Bank of England, all serial numbers were recorded in ledgers. Therefore, any bill that passed back to the bank could be checked. Depending on this number and value, each banknote had a watermark in the middle of the bill. Later, the curator of the Bank of England Museum, John Keyworth, noted the English had become, quote, a little complacent about the design of its notes and the production of them. The original plan was proposed in September of 1939 at a meeting of the Reichskriminalpolizeiamt, or the Central Criminal Investigation Department of Germany. Arthur Nebe, a high-level security officer for the German government, raised the idea. He suggested forging £30 billion. Afterward, the money would be distributed all over Britain, leading to financial collapse as well as a decline in Britain's status in global currency. His superior officer favored the plan, but didn't want to skulk around police files looking for criminals to assist. The Reich Minister of Propaganda responded to it in disgust, saying it was, quote, grotesque, but still admitted there was potential in the idea. The main detractor against the plan was Walter Funk, the Third Reich's Minister for Economic Affairs. He worried that the project was sharply contradicting international law. Of course, Nebe only really needed support from one man. Adolf Hitler approved it. Although the meeting was supposed to be secret, the British ambassador to Greece, Michael Palaret, was briefed on the plan by a Russian émigré in November of 1939. At that point, the plot was reportedly called, quote, offensive against sterling and destruction of its position as world currency. The Bank of England and the U.S. Department of the Treasury were both informed. However, the English felt that their existing security infrastructure couldn't sustain the attack. Therefore, they resolved to do little more than releasing a blue emergency £1 note, fixed with a security thread running through. In 1940, they banned the import of pound banknotes during the war. Since these countermeasures didn't completely protect the public, they did put out PSAs regarding counterfeit money and stopped producing £5 notes. With Hitler's seal of approval, a counterfeiting unit was created for Operation Andreas, which kicked off in early 1940 under the Sicherheitsdienst Department. It was led by Alfred Naujoks, who'd been plucked from the Schutzstaffel. Day-to-day operations was overseen by Naujoks' technical director, the code-breaking mathematician Albert Langer. Divided into 3 parts, Operation Andreas produced rag paper, assembled identical printing plates, and duplicated the British serial number system. To make the project efficient and manageable, they focused on the £5 notes, the most widely circulated. The Germans sent samples of real pound notes for analysis and determined the paper to be used must be handmade. Later on, they discovered that sourcing material from cotton rags created a more polished, less suspicious banknote. Therefore, local factories used rags, while the operation cleaned and processed them to make paper. The method worked. Although in natural light it resembled British money, under ultraviolet, they seemed duller. They decided to change the chemical balance of the water used in production to that of the United Kingdom. It solved the problem. Langer contacted banking experts, examining 20 years of currency records to replicate the correct order for the coded alphanumeric serial codes. To this day, no one knows exactly how the Germans discovered the correct sequence. Historians suspect they used cryptoanalysis techniques. German engravers struggled to recreate the image of Britannia, even nicknaming the icon, quote, Bloody Britannia. Nearly 7 months later, they perfected her figure, which nevertheless still bore incorrectly drawn eyes. Despite these setbacks, the operation progressed, albeit not at a slow pace. However, in late 1940, Naujoks was relieved of his position over squabbles with superiors. Langer replaced him until early 1942. The unit was temporarily closed. In 18 months of operation, they had reportedly forged 3 million British pounds, although some historians estimate higher. Still, the money designed during that initial operation sat mostly unused. According to Britain's National Archives blog writer Richard Donnelly, quote, the instructions came from Hitler himself, who wanted to drop huge quantities of forged banknotes from German aircraft. However, the High Command's bizarre plan never came to pass. It was exposed after Alfred Naujoks was arrested in 1944. By then, he was already infamous among Allied intelligence members for his elemental role in sparking the war. 5 years earlier, he had organized and executed the Gleiwitz incident. The operation transcribed anti-German hate speech through Polish radio stations. The plant paid off. Its criminal hate speech served as grounds for Germany to invade. Naujoks divulged that he was, in fact, the leader of Operation Bernhard. He explained that his team trained and used 140 Jewish prisoners from the Sachsenhausen camp to forge the banknotes. Furthermore, they had hired a specialized company to provide the rag paper. In early 1945, Naujok's group relocated to the Mauthausen-Gusen camp in Austria, before moving to the Riedel-Zipf tunnels and lastly to the Ebensee concentration camp. In July 1942, the operation was revived with a new goal in mind. Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler now wanted to use counterfeit British money to finance German intelligence operations. The security services under his command were too underfunded to do so. In place of Naujok's, Himmler put SS Major Bernhard Kruger in charge of daily operations. He recovered the copper engraving plates and machinery from the original effort. Unfortunately, some of the equipment was damaged. Kruger sourced labor from concentration camps at Sachsenhausen blocks 18 and 19. The area was separated by barbed wire and under watch from an SS guard unit. He would personally recruit prisoners from other camps, assembling a team of draftsmen, engravers, and experts in banking or printing. He enlisted the first 26 participants by September 1942, and an additional 80 people in December. Interestingly, Kruger would address these prisoners with the formal German pronoun Sie, something that rarely happened when Nazis addressed Jews. The prisoners received some favor from him, including cigarettes, newspapers, and more food portions. They were also provided with a ping-pong table and some surprise visits from performers. The printing equipment and 12,000 sheets of banknote paper arrived in December, and production kicked off by January. It would be a year before they matched the output pace of Operation Andreas. Each sector of the printing process was supervised by a prisoner, with former office manager Oscar Stein overseeing the lot. The 140 forced laborers would work 2 12-hour shifts in a continuous production line. After printing, the sheets were dried and the edges were folded to distress. Further aging was done by having 40 to 50 prisoners pass them around, leaving dirt and sweat on them, folding and unfolding them, wrinkling them, and pinching the corners. Sometimes they would write English names and addresses on the back or write numbers on the front, mimicking bank teller markings. The Germans graded the finished notes using a 1 to 4 scale of quality. Grade 1 notes were for transactions in neutral countries and to pay spies. Grade 2 was for operation collaborators. Grade 3 was planned for dropping over the UK, while Grade 4 was destroyed. Between 1943 and 44, this assembly line produced 65,000 notes a month. The Germans were ecstatic, and even awarded 12 prisoners, with 3 Jewish ones, the War Merit Medal. In May 1944, the prisoners received an order to begin producing US dollars. The intricate artwork, intaglio printing process, and small silk threading made the request incredibly challenging. Furthermore, the prisoners knew that if they accurately produced these dollars, they would probably be executed, and Germans would take over the project. Without the supervisors noticing, they slowed down their work. Allegedly, only one of their bosses knew, Kruger himself. He had a vested interest in continuing the operation, as it kept him away from the front lines. Still, the team managed to produce an accurate reverse of the dollar in late 1944. In January 1945, the prisoners cracked the face. 20 samples of $100 bills were made and presented to Himmler. The printing and engraving work was deemed excellent, but the paper quality was subpar. The dollar forgery didn't go far. The fake money was sent to the SS facility in South Tyrol Schloss Labers. They laundered it through an operation led by Friedrich Svend, in charge of a black market smuggling and forgery business since the 1930s. He struck a deal with the government to keep a third of the money he laundered. 25% of that went to his agents and employees. He used a network of 50 agents and sub-agents he called salesmen, stationed in different countries. Some were Jewish, considering no one would suspect them of collaborating with Nazi Germany. Agents were told the banknotes came from banks in conquered territories. The mission was simple: to exchange the fake money for real francs or dollars and fund special operations. Among these funded works was the purchase of black market weapons in Yugoslavia to sell back to German sympathizers. Spies were also paid in fake money. Most notably, the counterfeited banknotes were used to obtain information for the Gran Sasso raid, which liberated the captive Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini. All forgeries ended by early March of 1945. The advance of the Allied forces meant equipment and teams were sent to the Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp in Austria. They moved again to Riedel-Zipf, ordered to continue operations, but the prisoners were ordered to destroy all work. The few surviving banknotes and remaining equipment were thrown in the Toplitz and Grundlsee lakes. The remaining forgery expert prisoners were moved to Ebensee concentration camp in small groups for several days. Explicit orders to German soldiers stated prisoners had to be executed altogether. Since they were split into 3 transportation groups, this guideline bought them some, if not little, time. 2 groups were taken by truck to the camp, while the third had to walk a distance of 2 days' travel after their vehicle malfunctioned. Due to the delay and the advance of the Allies, the two groups were released into the concentration camp's general population while their SS guards deserted. When the third group finally arrived, it was also released into the general camp population, and its guards fled. The next day, they were liberated by US soldiers. As for how much fake money they created, estimates range from £132 million to over $300 million. The exact number may remain a mystery. On the morning of September 8th, 1944, Germany introduced a new secret weapon to its already deadly World War II. It came out of nowhere and caused a massive explosion in Paris. There was nothing to compare it to. The weapon was part of Germany's Wunderwaffe, its miracle weapons program, created in a last-ditch effort to shift the war's balance in the Third Reich's favor. The V-2 rocket, nicknamed the Retribution Weapon II, was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. No defensive systems of the time could do anything to counter the weapon, and V-2s rarely failed to reach their targets. They were extremely fast, powerful, and precise. The Allied forces, desperate to find an efficient way to counter the V-2's sheer effectiveness, realized that there was only one way to avoid further destruction. The solution was destroying the secret German military bases where they were assembled. Operation Crossbow's objective was simple: find the enemy bases where the V-2s were located and blow them to smithereens. But things weren't going to be that easy. The Allies soon realized that there were not 2, or 4, or 10 research facilities, but more than 50 scattered all over Europe. A race against time was undertaken to destroy them all before the bombs could disrupt American supply lines in France. Everything seemed lost to the Allies, until an innovative method created by the British intelligence seemed to offer hope. Cutting-edge 3D photography would reveal where the V-2 launch sites were hidden. World War II began in 1939, when the Third Reich and the Soviet Union attacked Poland and divided the country into 2 blocks. One became part of Germany, and the other of the USSR. After months of tension, Belgium, France, and the British Empire declared war on Germany for other countries' occupation in Northern Europe. After the astonishing and effective blitzkrieg campaigns, Germany took over most of Europe except for neutral and allied nations. Everything went well for the German Heer until 1943. After the initial success of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets, supported by the Americans and the British, began to counterattack. Simultaneously, American and British bombers slowly but steadily increased their bombing raids over German sites like Hamburg, Lübeck, and Dresden. These bombing raids did not distinguish between military and civilian targets, which caused severe and permanent damages to historic buildings, alongside tragic civilian casualties. Every structure, military and non-military alike, was crushed in Operation Gomorrah, appropriately referencing the Old Testament biblical city destroyed by fire and brimstone. Al Murray, in his new show Why Does Everyone Hate the English, cited a Royal Air Force bomber command that once said, quote, "The government, for excellent reasons, has preferred the world to think that we still held some scruples and attacked only what the humanitarians are pleased to call military targets. I can assure you, gentlemen, that we tolerate no scruples." The Führer, Adolf Hitler, angry at the destruction that Allies bombers were causing to German cities, demanded to make the Allies pay for what they had done. With a desire for payback, Hitler immediately ordered the production of a secret wonder weapon that had been in development since the beginning of the conflict. It was the Vergeltungswaffen, or Retribution Weapon 2, the V-2 rocket. As its name said, the weapon would avenge the civilian casualties and damage done to German cities by Allied bombing raids. V-2 rockets were an evolution of the V-1, an early cruise missile. However, the V-2 was larger, faster, and more potent than its predecessor. The rocket was 14 meters tall and equipped with a 907-kilogram Amitol warhead at the tip. Its size gave it a range of 320 kilometers, with a maximum speed of 5,760 kilometers per hour. This rocket was fast. Really fast. Its speed and range made it practically impossible to intercept. Allied attempts at jamming the V-2's guidance system was useless, because the warhead did not use radio guidance. Instead, the V-2 rocket was guided by gyroscopes and an analog computer that continually monitored its course to adjust it accordingly. The V-2 was intended to be launched from complexes similar to modern missile silos. But Allied bombing raids and the infantry advances on the ground forced the military to rely on mobile launch platforms that were moved continuously to avoid being targeted by enemy aircraft. More than 5,500 V-2 rockets were built between 1943 and 1945, with almost 100 launched every day since the first one hit Paris in September 1944. The rockets wreaked havoc on Allied cities. Between 5,000 to 9,000 military and civilian personnel lost their lives, and 30,000 were injured by the damage caused by the V-2s. During the first months of 1943, Allied bombing raids were quickly escalating in Germany. By May, members of the High Command had already envisioned the possibilities of launching an amphibious assault on the northern and southern coasts of France to begin the liberation of Europe. During these days, while conducting air surveillance of enemy activity, Allied recon aircraft identified the construction of various German facilities in northern France. Simultaneously, other secret facilities were spotted across Germany and the Scandinavian countries. Some Allied officers feared that the Germans were building chemical or biological weapons. Others believed that it was a strategy to distract the Allies from the bombing raids. Through Polish intelligence, the British Secret Intelligence Service received valuable reports that Germany was working on a secret rocket at Peenemünde, where a facility was located. Wishing to stop any weapon development that could favor the Germans, the War Cabinet Defense Committee decided to take action. During a meeting held in June, Winston Churchill said, quote, "Peenemünde is beyond the range of our radio navigation beams, and we must bomb by moonlight. Although the German night fighters will be close at hand, and it is too far to send our own. Nevertheless, we must attack it on the heaviest possible scale." The result was Operation Hydra, launched on August 17, 1943. This Royal Air Force Bomber Command mission's objective was to dismantle the German Scientific Research Center at Peenemünde. For maximizing the accuracy and damage of the bombing raids, the British decided that it would be best to attack during a full moon at 2,400 meters. This was meant to diminish casualties and fulfill the secondary objectives, like destroying the quarters where the facility's scientists and engineers lived. During the nights of August 17th and 18th, the British 83rd Squadron, a force of 500 bombers under Captain John Searby's command, bombed the area. They lost 215 aircrews and 40 bomber aircraft. the Luftwaffe lost 12 night fighters and more than 170 civilians, including scientists and engineers. Although no permanent damage was provoked to the facility itself. To prevent more attacks on Peenemünde, the Germans painted signs of bomb damage to the facility to fool Allied recon planes. Scientist Siegfried Winter would write, quote, "We climbed onto the roofs and painted black and white lines to simulate charred beams." The bombing was deemed a success because it forced the German military to rely on mobile and not static launch sites for the V-2 rockets. Operation Hydra became the first of a series of bombing raids that the Allied command would eventually rename Operation Crossbow, intended to destroy any secret military of V-2 rockets' launch facilities. In November 1943, British reconnaissance aircraft discovered the first of 96 sites for the V-1 and V-2 rockets. The Allies tracked down these launch sites using photos taken with a stereoscope that showed the enemy landscape in 3D. The pictures allowed British photographic interpreters to measure height and other data to identify hidden structures and launch sites across Europe. The technique proved decisive for stopping the onslaught caused by the effective V-2 rockets. To render the 3D effect, images had to be captured in sequences that overlapped each other by 60%, so they could stand up when viewed through the stereoscope. Pilots of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, aboard British Spitfires, took millions of photographs to recreate highly detailed maps. The Spitfires from this unit were unarmed, as they carried 5 cameras that left no space for any type of armament. Flying at 9,000 meters, they could not afford to take any extra weight. 88-year-old Jimmy Taylor, a reconnaissance pilot and the only survivor from the unit, told BBC, quote, "We had no guns, no bullets, so I didn't kill anyone. Physically, there's nothing left of the air fights, nothing left of the bombing. But the photographs are still with us, and they're still useful." From the last months of 1943 to Germany's surrender in May of 1945, British and American bombers carried out bombing missions on most of the 96 launch sites to disrupt the launch of the V-2 rockets. If it were not for the effectiveness of the 3D pictures, more than 9,000 lives would have been claimed by the first ballistic missile. Alan Williams, curator of the National Collection of Aerial Photography, in a report about the operation said to the BBC, quote, "Without this photographic intelligence, the Germans could have launched potentially devastating attacks on Britain before D-Day that could have easily changed the outcome of the war." Although the V-2 rocket was an effective weapon with no real opposition since it was first used, like many other wonder weapons, it came too late in the war to make a change in favor of Germany. Nevertheless, the V-2 left a lasting legacy. Combined with the introduction of nuclear weapons, it proves that the most important weapons of the future would be ballistic missiles. And the V-2 rocket was the first of its kind. After the war ended, the Soviets and the Allies tried to collect as much information from the V-2 program as possible. The earliest Soviet and American ballistic missiles of the Cold War were copies of the V-2. German scientists from the V-2 program, including its leader, Werner von Braun, helped develop other weapons for the US and the USSR at the Cold War's height. In von Braun's case, he was directly involved in the US space program, helping NASA land on the moon in 1969. On March 22, 1945, General Patton's Third Army charged through the Rhine, making a beeline for the heart of Germany. They swept northeast, breaking through the Soviet zone, eyes set on Gotha. But fate had other plans, diverting them unexpectedly to Merkers. A few weeks later, the 358th Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion seized the village, unknowingly stumbling upon a revelation. Whispers circulated about hidden Reichsbank gold in the Kaiserroda potassium mine. On April 5th, rumors from displaced Germans reached the intelligence units. The race was on as troops ventured into the mine's depths. Behind a closed vault lay what was possibly the most splendid treasure ever amassed. The war was coming to an end, but the dark truth about the riches hidden in the deep mine were just coming out into the light. With Allied bombings rattling Berlin, a pivotal decision was made to safeguard the wealth of the German Reichsbank. Facing the imminent threat, a clandestine operation unfolded to transfer vast portions of gold and currency reserves to the Kaiserroda potassium mine in Merkers. On February 11th, a convoy of railcars transported a staggering billion Reichsmarks, gold reserves, and a significant cache of foreign currency to the depths of Merkers, finding refuge in a specially designated vault known as Room Number 8. Simultaneously, in an intricate web of movements, currency and personnel were dispatched to the Reichsbank branch in Erfurt. The SS Office for Economy and Administration, notorious for overseeing concentration camps, added to the surreal drama by channeling seized loot, gold jewelry, securities, foreign currency, from the camps to the Reichsbank for safekeeping. In March 1945, under the watchful eye of Albert Thoms, head of the Reichsbank's precious metals department, the SS loot arrived at Merkers. Gold and silver bars, along with a trove of treasures stashed in suitcases and trunks, found sanctuary in Room Number 8. The Reichsminister for Education, foreseeing the storm, ordered the evacuation of artistic treasures to mines in March. Dr. Paul Ortwin Raab was entrusted with overseeing the relocation of 1/4 of the major holdings of 14 principal Prussian state museums to Merkers. As the Third Army closed in on Merkers, desperate attempts were made to move the reserves, including artworks, back to Berlin. Hindered by the relentless American advance and logistical chaos caused by the Easter holidays, the efforts proved futile. By April 2nd, the focus shifted to Reichsmarks, and on April 4th, a group of bank officials rushed to Merkers to retrieve the currency. With the imminent arrival of American forces, chaos ensued. German officials, assisted by Polish workers, attempted a hasty retreat with the currency, but the advancing Americans interrupted their efforts. Fearing capture, some officials fled, setting documents ablaze, while others desperately tried to reverse the flow of currency back into the mine. In early 1945, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army breached the Rhine and advanced into the heart of Germany. On April 4th, the 3rd Battalion of the 358th Infantry Regiment, 90th Infantry Division, claimed Merkers, setting the stage for an extraordinary discovery. Whispers circulating among displaced persons hinted at the relocation of the German Reichsbank gold to the Kaiserroda potassium mine in Merkers. However, it was not until April 5th that credible information emerged, when some French people with first-hand knowledge disclosed the mine's hidden treasures to the G2 intelligence section. Swift action ensued, with Lieutenant Colonel William A. Russell verifying the claims and deploying military units to secure the mine's entrances. Major General Herbert L. Ernest, grasping the gravity of the revelation, ordered reinforcements from the 357th Infantry Regiment. However, caution prevailed, as General Manton S. Eddy, in contact with Patton, advised against confirming the gold's capture until definitive verification. Unraveling the historical tapestry, the strategic dispersion of the Reichsbank's assets, the response to Allied bombings menacing Berlin, comes to light. In February 1945, President Walter Funk orchestrated the transfer of gold reserves, valued at $238 million to the Merkers mine for safekeeping, shielding Germany's financial lifeline from the ravages of war. If validated, the capture of the German gold reserves in Merkers bore immense strategic significance, potentially dealing a decisive blow to Germany's capacity to procure vital war materials and hastening the war's end. On April 7, 1945, military personnel interrogated civilians to unveil the hidden storage of Reich property in the Merkers mine. Simultaneously, new entrances were discovered in Leimbach, Ransbach, and Springen, swiftly guarded by station forces, including tanks from the 1st Battalion of the 357th Infantry Regiment. By 10 a.m. on April 8th, a diverse group, including Russell, Signal Corps photographers, Robb, and German mining officials, descended 2,100 feet into the Merkers mine. They found 550 bags of Reichsmarks in the main haulageway. Progressing further, they encountered the main vault, sealed by a 3-foot-thick brick wall and an imposing steel door. Attempts to open it failed, but confirmation came that gold lay behind it. General Eddy was notified, and Patton ordered the vault door to be blown. At 5 p.m., most of the 357th Infantry Regiment moved out, but the 1st Battalion continued guarding the mine entrances. On April 8th, a group, including General Eddy and Russell, entered the mine. Engineers used dynamite to breach the vault, revealing room number 8, which was filled with a staggering treasure trove: 8,198 bars of gold bullion, assorted gold items, various currencies, silver bars, and more. The enormity of this discovery prompted General Eddy to countermand the withdrawal order, directing the 357 to secure the mine. As the treasure review continued, artworks were found in other tunnels, drawing museums, fine arts, and archives officers. News of the gold discovery reached Patton, who urgently contacted General Bradley, seeking intervention from Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, recognizing the political implications of the find becoming public knowledge. As Deputy Chief of the Financial Branch, G5 Division of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, Colonel Bernard Bernstein's journey commenced with a headline in the New York Herald Tribune. His concern about the authenticity of reports led to a pivotal exchange with Colonel Barrett of the Third Army, and subsequently with Brigadier General McSherry at the Advance Headquarters in Reims. In short order, General Eisenhower entrusted Bernstein with the reins of command. Navigating communication challenges with personnel on the ground, Bernstein faced initial uncertainty about the treasure's contents. Coordinating with Barrett and on-site operatives, it was eventually confirmed that the mine harbored over 100 tons of gold, foreign currency, Reichsmarks, and priceless paintings. Eisenhower's directive tasked Bernstein with securing the treasure's transfer to a more fortified location. General Crawford's instructions outlined Bernstein's responsibilities and restricted access to the mine. Teamed with Lieutenant Colonel Carl L. Morris, Bernstein orchestrated the movement of the treasure, opting for the Reichsbank building in Frankfurt after a thorough inspection. Collaborating with local officers, they meticulously planned the takeover and relocation. Visits to potential storage sites culminated in the selection of the Reichsmark building. General McSherry requisitioned the Reichsmark building site. Engineers prepared it for secure storage, and Bernstein and Barrett finalized plans. On April 10th, Bernstein explored the Merkers mine, gathering information from officials. A subsequent meeting with Patton affirmed support for Eisenhower's responsibility. The saga extended, with MFAA officers Stout and Webb handling art treasures, while Morris ensured the secure transfer of this unprecedented wealth. On April 11, 1945, a pivotal chapter unfolded as Colonel Bernstein received a crucial directive. The message instructed him to ensure the readiness of a main entrance to the mine by 9 a.m. the next morning. General Patton was set to pay a visit. Bernstein diligently prepared the mine and its equipment, even arranging for German civilians to be available for questioning. As the clock struck the appointed hour, anticipation filled the air. However, Patton was still at his headquarters, engaged in cordial greetings with General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. The trio eventually flew to Merkers, arriving at the mine around 10:30 a.m. Descending into the depths via elevator, Bernstein and Patton, displaying a hint of nervous humor, voiced concerns about the safety of the operation. Their destination was room number 8. Eisenhower, witnessing the spoils of war, was visibly moved by flattened gold and silver items stripped from European homes. Amid suitcases filled with jewelry acquired through dubious means, plans were devised to inventory and transport the treasures to Frankfurt. Bernstein disclosed that some of the items bore a sinister origin, having been plundered from concentration camp victims. The generals, including Brigadier General Otto P. Wayland, endorsed the decision to move the items. The tour unfolded to reveal not only art, but also plates used in printing Reichsmark currency and the currency itself. A German official claimed the currency was destined for the German army, but Bradley expressed, quote, "I doubt the German army will be meeting payrolls much longer." The inspection concluded with Bradley teasing Patton, quote, "If these were the old freebooting days when a soldier kept his loot, you'd be the richest man in the world." Following the tour, discussions among Bradley, Eisenhower, and Patton delved into the discovery of gold. Patton, initially inclined towards secrecy, faced questions from Bradley about the necessity of such measures. The conversation turned reflective as they pondered the fate of the gold, whether to distribute it among soldiers or reserve it for post-war weapon procurement. As the night unfolded, the gravity of the era intensified, with the untimely news of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's passing. Post-tour, Bernstein conducted interviews, unraveling the intricate web of German policy that led to the storage of files and treasures in mines and tunnels. In the midst of April, Morris orchestrated the transfer of a significant trove of art and treasures. Collaborating with military brass, including Colonel Perry, the transportation officer, and the deputy chief of engineers, Morris meticulously planned personnel deployment and security measures. Facing challenges inspecting art in the Ransbach mine due to a malfunctioning elevator, MFAA Officer Stout returned to Merkers, where he discovered loose artwork amidst crated items. Recognizing the urgency of proper packing, Stout diligently prepared the Ransbach art for the impending move. On April 12th, a Frankfurt team descended to assist. Tasks were assigned, including overseeing money container markings, analyzing testimonies for additional deposits, and inspecting the mine's depths. Simultaneously, 4 teams commenced the inventory of the mine's contents. The actual move unfolded on April 15th, as 32 trucks, forming Task Force Whitney, departed Merkers for Frankfurt, under Colonel Walker's vigilant eye. Escorted by infantry and military police, the convoy began a meticulous unloading process supervised by Bernstein. Concurrently, preparations for art transportation unfolded. Loading commenced on April 16th. Bernstein, wary of hidden assets, proposed a post-move plan to search for Nazi gold. The art convoy, now named Task Force Hansen, departed for Frankfurt, guided by Stout and Captain Dunn. The unloading and storing of artwork were completed that day, signifying the successful relocation of both treasure and art. The Allied forces stumbled upon a trove, a cache of gold, silver, and currency, appraised at a staggering $520 million, was laid bare before astonished American soldiers. This unprecedented discovery, however, would not only unravel tales of immense wealth, but also cast a haunting shadow of potential war crimes committed by the SS. A set of meticulous account books from Tom's Precious Metals Department, outlining the Reichsbank's gold holdings, became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Bernstein, recognizing the gravity of the situation, urgently communicated the need for a sweeping reconnaissance to locate hidden German assets scattered across mines and secret enclaves. Undeterred by challenges and a lack of support, Bernstein spearheaded a daring mission covering 1,900 miles, meticulously checking Reichsbanks throughout American-occupied Germany. The meager initial recovery of $3 million worth of Reichsbank gold was soon eclipsed by subsequent efforts in May and June, yielding an additional $11 million. Remarkably, by the mission's end, a staggering 98.6% of the $255.96 million in gold listed on the Precious Metals Department's closing balances had been recovered. In mid-August, experts from the U.S. Treasury Department and the Bank of England meticulously evaluated the captured treasure, gold coins, silver bars, and platinum, ultimately appraising it at a monumental $262.2 million. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, Allied currencies were repatriated, and the arduous process of returning artworks to their rightful owners commenced. The gold unearthed at Merkers took on a special significance. Entrusted to the Tripartite Commission for the Restitution of Monetary Gold, it was destined for redistribution among countries whose central bank gold had been pilfered by the Nazis. However, the machinations of the Cold War delayed the full restitution until 1996. Determining the value of SS loot found at Merkers proved to be a moral quandary. Non-monetary gold, extracted from victims of Nazi persecution, found its way to the International Restitution Organization. Bernstein's exhaustive reports became instrumental in the Nuremberg trials, where Walter Funk was held accountable. "10 days after World War II had taken the world by storm, horde after horde of German soldiers was pouring into Poland in an overwhelming attack to cripple the country's defenses as fast as possible. Consumed by fear and disorganization, the Polish troops desperately scrambled to slow down the invaders. One day, a group of Polish recruits was guarding a railroad bridge near Demblin that was critical to the German invasion and was preparing to demolish it. However, a group of highly motivated Polish soldiers suddenly came marching in while singing a Polish army tune. The newcomers offered to take over the bridge and execute the demolition, while the surprised commander tried to phone his superior to get directions. Out of nowhere, a Ju-87 Stuka dive bomb strike hit the location, sending everyone into cover. After the close call, the guards were happy to be relieved, leaving only a few men behind. The new unit then guarded the bridge for 5 hours until the German Panzer Corps arrived and attacked the remaining Polish personnel, causing a panic. The unit then handed control of the bridge to the Germans and changed into German uniforms. It was one of the first covert operations of the Brandenburg Commandos, a group of elite Nazi special forces specialized in deception and sabotage. Germany's plan to swiftly conquer Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg to overwhelm France by using aggressive tank and air raid tactics was a risky and ambitious scheme. For the strategy to work, the advancing German troops needed to use much of the railways, roads, and bridges inside the countries they were invading to cover vast territories and supply their forces in a short time. Of course, as soon as the invasion began, the defending countries would quickly demolish their own transportation structures to cripple the enemy's progress. Thus, even before the war erupted, the Nazi high command knew they needed to insert special agents deep within enemy territory to secure key assets. To achieve this objective, Germany made use of secretive agencies that had been in service since World War I. One of the covert operations organizations was Abwehr, controlled by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, a distinguished and clever officer with plenty of experience and a knack for languages. In 1939, just as Germany prepared to conquer Europe, the organization consisted of 3 sections. Abwehr I oversaw espionage and intelligence gathering. Abwehr II specialized in sabotage and special units, and Abwehr III was tasked with counterintelligence. Abwehr II was chosen to penetrate enemy territory and secure its infrastructure before the invasion. Captain Theodor von Hippel was in charge, an officer who'd closely studied the use of commandos in Germany's African colonies during World War II and diligently studied the writings of Lawrence of Arabia. With a clear understanding of the requirements to build up a force for deceit and sabotage operations, von Hippel began to recruit a small force of German fighting men from the border regions of the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia or the Silesian districts of Poland. The officer also looked for loyal Germans who had lived abroad or had expertise in the language and customs of potential enemies. However, von Hippel also needed recruits to be resourceful, imaginative, independent, and have a rebellious spirit not generally associated with a good soldier. In addition, the members of the special forces had to be volunteers, as only recruits would have the drive and passion needed for the extremely dangerous tasks they would undertake. The initial group comprised 80 men, most of whom were of Polish origin and highly proficient in the Polish language and culture. After training, these men infiltrated the country and successfully passed as Polish railway workers. The objective was to enable movement around the rail network, which they would eventually try to secure. On September 1st, 1939, just as the Wehrmacht began their incursion into Poland, the infiltrated commandos pulled out concealed weapons and surprised the Poles. One disguised group even convinced a body of Polish troops to board a train and leave. The operation was ultimately successful, taking a large part of the railroad system, while the German forces began to operate from Katowice Junction. Other groups, however, were not as successful. Some of them failed to be informed of a last-minute delay on the overall invasion and blew their cover before it was time. The Polish forces severely pummeled these commandos, and Germany was forced to disavow their existence, blaming Slovakian terrorists for the attacks instead. Despite the setbacks, the special operations were deemed a critical success for Germany's invasion, and Adolf Hitler immediately ordered the concept to be expanded. As such, the groups were assembled at Brandenburg at the end of the year, and given the formal status of Bauerle-Kompanie ZVB 800 on October 25th. Moreover, the organization took the name of the town just west of Berlin where they were assembled. Germany could not afford to get entangled in Holland and needed to force a speedy surrender to proceed with France's defeat. With this objective in mind, the Brandenburgers were deployed to secure essential assets before the Panzer Corps arrived. On the night of May 9, 1940, the Brandenburgers crossed the border and headed towards a railway bridge just inside the Dutch border at Ganap. Securing the crossing was vital for Germany, as it was in the path of the 9th Panzer Division, the only armored formation used in the invasion of the Netherlands. To secure the bridge, the commandos assumed the roles of 7 German prisoners, escorted by 2 Dutch soldiers. The prisoners were then taken to the bridge and suddenly attacked the position. A fierce and baffling skirmish ensued, as the Dutch guards didn't know how to react. A well-placed grenade then delivered the desired effect and detonated the moment the guards spotted German tanks approaching. Despite the victory, the hazardous nature of such covert operations started to take its toll, as the commander of the Brandenburgers was mistaken for a Dutchman by a lead German vehicle, and he was cut down by machine gun fire. The man would survive and go on to receive the Iron Cross. Overall, the Brandenburgers' operations were a significant success, not only managing to secure the bridge at Ganap, but also seizing critical bridges in Roermond and Stavelot. The unique special forces continued their successful streak by repeating their highly reliable formula in Belgium. In World War I, the Belgians had successfully flooded the Yser Plain by opening the sluice gates at Nieuwpoort, impeding the Germans' progress and managing to keep 5% of the Belgian territory despite overwhelming odds. The German commandos were not willing to let that happen again, and on May 27th, they drew close to Ostende as Belgium was close to surrendering. Wearing Belgian infantry uniforms, 13 commandos then blended with a large crowd and boarded a Belgian army bus. Amid utter chaos and a sea of refugees, the Germans managed to reach Nieuwpoort and surprise the British soldiers holding the bridge, then quickly changed into their German uniforms. While their comrades kept the British busy, a pair of commandos crawled across the bridge, covered by darkness, and caught the explosive charges, just as a storm of bullets flew over their heads. Upon reaching the far side, the 2 commandos opened fire on the perplexed British troops, while the rest of the Germans charged the bridge, using submachine guns and hand grenades. The Brandenburgers took control of the bridge and the pump houses in Nieuwpoort, effectively preventing the Belgians from flooding the Yser Plain before the Germans conquered the entire country. After the fall of France, the commandos were recalled to Germany to train for the eventual invasion of Britain. They were stationed in Quincy for a period of intensive exercises and expansion to regiment strength. Incoming recruits learned all the skills associated with special forces, emphasizing deception techniques. The men underwent highly unorthodox training, regularly paraded in foreign uniforms, and used a system of trust instead of obedience among the ranks. The complete disregard for military tradition soon earned them the disdain of local military forces, as they would perform risky and brazen training exercises, like taking the fingerprints of the local chief of police without him realizing it, or capturing 10 German soldiers in 5 hours and taking them to their base. Soon, German regulars regarded the Brandenburgers as an aberration of the German military tradition and values. As time went on, it became clear that Operation Sea Lion and the invasion of Britain would not take place anytime soon. So the Brandenburgers were instead deployed to serve as precursors for Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. By the time Germany was ready to pierce the Soviet borders, Brandenburgers had already infiltrated behind enemy lines. They wore Soviet coats over their field uniforms and drove trucks previously seized by the Finns. However, this time it wouldn't go as planned. Despite each detachment being led by an agent proficient in Russian, they were unaware that the Soviets had employed a password system with a code that changed every night. As a result, many units blew their cover before the main attack began. Many Brandenburgers then found themselves attempting to flee through the Russian forests, while heavily engaged and with no hope of reinforcements. The commandos suffered heavy casualties during those days, but once the main attack began, the unit performed as successfully as ever. The Russians were especially prone to detonating bridges as soon as they detected any suspicious activity, so a new deception tactic was employed. The Brandenburgers approached such bridges and structures aboard 2 Soviet trucks driven by agents fluent in Russian. Then one of the trucks would cross the bridge while shouting that they were being pursued by German tanks. Meanwhile, the second truck would pretend to malfunction in the middle of the bridge, and the first truck driver would plead to the Soviets not to blow the bridge up before the other truck would pass. Amidst the chaos and confusion, Some commandos would locate the explosive charges and deactivate them before the Soviets realized what was happening. In one particular instance, the situation became incredibly tense when Soviet soldiers began to climb aboard the trucks filled with German commandos. The disguised Germans were forced to fight the Russians with the butt of their rifles inside the trucks as the drivers continued to carry on with the deception. Still, the commander in charge of the bridge was determined to blow it up, and the Germans were forced to abandon the deceit and take the post by force to hold it for over 15 brutal minutes before the Panzer could arrive. As the war continued and Germany started to lose its grip, the role of the Brandenburgers changed drastically. They continued to operate similarly to the early years of the war in the African and Greek campaigns, but they were soon forced to fight as regular soldiers. By 1944, with Germany on the defensive and the Allies holding a formidable intelligence network, Germany could not sustain such significant covert operations. Moreover, as men and resources dwindled, the remaining Brandenburgers were transformed into a regular regiment, tasked with defending their country. The ex-commandos fought until the war's final weeks, but most of them would not make it to the end. Nevertheless, the Brandenburgers proved to be an essential component in Germany's early blitzkrieg tactics and its overwhelming success in conquering a large part of Europe in a short period of time, ultimately fighting in the front line, just like any regular soldier. Military forces worldwide take assault rifles for granted, as they are the pillar of infantry forces. However, during World War II, only bolt-action rifles, light machine guns, and submachine guns existed. No intermediate cartridge or rifle could fill the gap between the powerful rifle cartridge and the smaller pistol round used by submachine guns. It was Hugo Schmeisser, the developer of the MP-18, who came up with a new type of weapon that combined the high rate of fire of a light machine gun, the power of a bolt-action rifle, and the maneuverability of a submachine gun in one single package, the STG-44. Baptized by Hitler as the Sturmgewehr, or Assault Rifle 44, the STG-44 quickly earned its place in military history as the rifle for close-quarters combat and long-range engagements in a new age of warfare. Artillery accounted for more than 60% of casualties during World War I. Next in line was the machine gun. The machine gun had a lethal rate of fire of over 400 to 500 rounds a minute and could obliterate an entire regiment relatively quickly as it approached a defensive line during a charge. Heavy machine guns fired the same cartridges as infantry rifles, but with a faster rate of fire than an entire platoon. Bolt-action rifles were standard issue for soldiers during the conflict. Although effective at long ranges, they were cumbersome for trench warfare and close-quarters engagements. Although soldiers could shoot more than 10 rounds a minute to maintain an elevated volume of fire against the enemy, the rounds rarely landed on the enemy, especially when charging across no man's land, where artillery shells and machine gun fire tore apart entire regiments. Soldiers required a new type of weapon to suppress the enemy, one that was lighter, shorter, and capable of automatic fire. While the United States had John Browning, designer of the Colt M1911 45 caliber pistol, the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, as well as other firearms, the German Empire had Hugo Schmeisser, developer of the world's first successful submachine gun, the MP-18. Schmeisser concluded that 7.92mm rifles were inadequate for storming trenches and developed a compact automatic weapon that employed 9mm pistol caliber rounds that prioritized maneuverability and recoil at the cost of accuracy and long-range effectiveness. The machine pistol MP-18 weighed 9 pounds and featured a side-mounted snail drum magazine. It became an instant favorite among the stormtroopers trained to seize enemy trenches with overwhelming firepower. The success of the MP-18 paved the way for post-war designs that sought to develop a rifle with an intermediate cartridge between pistol and machine gun rounds. The idea to develop an intermediate round for use with the German military dates back to the last months of World War I. Captain Pederet, a member of the Gewehrprüfungskommission, or the Small Arms Proofing Committee, pointed out that an intermediate round would save powder and brass while allowing troops to carry more ammunition. In addition, Pederet concluded that firefights occurred at distances lower than 600 meters, making Gewehr's cartridge a waste. Although the MP-18 was perfect for close-quarters combat, the captain aimed for a rifle with increased range and firepower for that gap between the 9mm pistol round and the 7.92mm round employed by the machine gun or rifle. The idea was retaken in 1923 when the German army sought to replace the Gewehr 98 bolt-action rifle. To replace the Mauser, The new model had to have a range of at least 400 meters or 440 yards, and a 20 or 30 round magazine capacity with a rate of fire of over 450 rounds a minute. In 1934, the Heereswaffenamt, or Army Ordnance Bureau, fully commenced the development of a mid-range cartridge with the specifications mentioned. In 1938, the Wehrmacht issued a contract to C.G. Heinel Waffenfabrik to develop a machine carbine for the new 7.92 by 33mm cartridge that would serve as a submachine gun and squad automatic rifle, or SAW. Once again, Hugo Schmeischer, developer of the MP-18, came up with a groundbreaking design. He set the rifle's barrel and stock in a straight line to reduce recoil, used a gas action that drove the pistol and actuated the bolt, chose a V-sight aft and hooded sight up front, and implemented a pistol grip for the trigger. The result was a new type of rifle design that was all metal except for the buttstock. Accelerated trials followed in 1939 as the Reich prepared to invade Poland, and the latest version would soon be put to the test. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 accelerated the new rifle program. Despite its innovative blitzkrieg tactics, the German infantry was still equipped with bolt-action rifles, machine guns, and submachine guns, or SMGs, similar to other European armies. When faced with the Soviets, the Heer realized it lacked mass production weapons such as the SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle and the PPSH-41 submachine gun. German troops were overwhelmed by the elevated volume of fire of Red Army squads and issued requests for automatic weapons that could even the odds against the enemy. The MP-40 was an excellent SMG, but it was limited to squad leaders, and no design could match the SVT-40. This need grew exponentially in 1942 when the US joined the war. American soldiers were also armed with other automatic rifles, such as the BAR, the M1 Garand, and the M1A1 carbine. While the Heer struggled to mass-produce the so-desired intermediate cartridge rifle, the FG-42, or Paratrooper Rifle 42, was introduced. Although developed specifically for the elite Fallschirmjägers, it paved the way for the Gewehr 43, or Karabiner 43, which allowed the Army to have a competitor against the SVT-40 on the Eastern Front. More importantly, the FG-42 employed the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz round and was fully automatic, allowing the new rifle design by Hugo Schmeischer to be accepted by the Army under the designation MKB-42. More than 11,000 MKB-42s were tested in early 1943. The weapon was reliable and accurate at ranges of up to 900 feet or 274 meters. Some units at the Eastern Front were even airdropped with the prototypes developed by the companies Walter and Heinel and were satisfied with their performance. Nevertheless, when the Führer became aware of the MKB-42 program, he ordered all work on the weapon to be stopped, because he believed a new rifle cartridge would strain the already saturated munition industry and the Army's logistics. To avoid the program's cancellation, the Heereswaffenamt changed the MKB-42 designation to Maschinenpistole 43, or MP-43, to make Hitler believe it was an upgraded version of the MP-40 SMG. Still, the Führer figured out the deception and demanded to see the rifle in action to see if it was suitable for combat operations. The leader was so impressed by the weapon that he suggested naming it the Sturmgewehr, or assault rifle, coining the term for a new class of weapon the world had never seen. Thus, the first assault rifle was born, and its earliest batches were delivered in late 1943 to Waffen-SS and Heer units stationed at the Eastern Front. Although these first rifles were prototypes, the STG-44 officially began mass production in the first months of 1944 with a standard 30-round magazine. With a rate of fire of over 540 rounds a minute, muzzle velocity of 685 meters per second, and range of 300 to 600 meters, the STG-44 became an instant tactical asset for the German soldiers. The 16-inch barrel allowed for close, medium, and long-range engagements, closing the gap between submachine guns, rifles, and light machine guns. Soldiers could use full auto sprays with minimal recoil or semi-automatic fire for even more accurate shots when fighting Red Army troops employing Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifles. The STG-44 weighed 11 pounds with its curved magazine and was only 37 inches long, including the barrel, making it the ideal size for those intermediate ranges. New tactics were soon implemented for units armed with STG-44s. Soldiers would use their assault rifles and automatic fire alongside the squad's MG-34 or MG-42 to suppress the enemy, while others approached with grenades to finish them off. When close-quarters combat was the only option, soldiers with STGs charged forward alongside their squad leader, armed with an MP-40 or stolen Soviet PPSH. The assault rifle versatility was exploited even more, with a wide array of unique attachments. Late in the war, the Heer introduced a unique accessory to bolster the STG's effectiveness at close range. This was the Krummlauf, a curved barrel with a periscope that allowed soldiers to fire around corners without exposing themselves to the enemy. It came in two variants, one meant to be used by the infantry and another for tankers. The curved barrel was delivered in versions with 30, 45, 60, and 90-degree bends. Although effective, the Krummlauf had a very short lifespan. The 30-degree version had a life cycle of no more than 300 rounds. This number plummeted with each increment in angle. For example, the 60-degree version had a life cycle of a few over 200 rounds. The angle produced great stress on the barrel and the round, sometimes resulting in the bullets getting shattered and exiting in fragments with a shotgun effect. Some STGs were also armed with telescopic sights, used with the FG-42 and the Gewehr-43, to maximize the accuracy of soldiers engaging forces at ranges past 200 meters. Another attachment was the Vampyr, or the Zielgerät 1229 infrared aiming device. This unique device consisted of a large scope and a large infrared lamp on the top to pick up the infrared that human eyes could not see in the darkness. It had a range of over 200 meters and was powered by a battery the soldier carried in a transformer backpack that only provided 15 minutes of battery life. When using the Vampyr, the soldier had to use his rifle with a conical flash hider to prevent the muzzle flash from blinding him when firing. More than 420,000 STG-44 assault rifles and 822 million rounds were produced by the war's end. Although the rifle bolstered the combat effectiveness of the German soldier, it was never produced in large enough numbers to make a difference against the eventual Allied victory. Still, the first assault rifle ever developed left a big impression on the victors of World War II, leading to detailed evaluations of the STG-44 to create improved designs. Such was the case of the Soviet Automat Kalashnikova, or AK-47, introduced in 1949 to the Red Army. Like the STG-44, the AK also employed an intermediate cartridge and featured a similar gas operation principle and exterior design. It's no coincidence that Hugo Schmeisser, the STG's designer, and several of his team members were captured by the Red Army and forced to work with Kalashnikov after the war. During an interview from 2009 that commemorated Kalashnikov's 90th birthday, he admitted that he might have been helped by Hugo Schmeisser and his team when he designed the iconic Soviet rifle. Another recognizable assault rifle still used today, the M16, developed by Eugene Stoner, was also inspired by the German STG when he came up with the quintessential American assault rifle, first introduced in the 1960s. Curiously enough, the AK-47 and the M16 served alongside the STG-44 during the Cold War. Thousands of captured STGs were used by the East German Army until they were gradually replaced by AKs in the late 60s. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia also used STG-44s until the 1980s. More importantly, the Sturmgewehr found its way to Vietnam in 1945, when the French military sought to regain control of its former colony. French troops and units of the Foreign Legion were armed with STG-44s to fight the guerrilla. As the war dragged on until the 1970s, the Vietnamese Communist forces were also supplied by the Soviet Union with German assault rifles that remained in service until the American troops withdrew from East Asia. It was not uncommon for American GIs to take STGs as war trophies after defeating the enemy. Pictures and footage from Vietnam allowed the German assault rifle to earn its status as a legendary weapon due to its reliability 20 years after its introduction. Besides Indochina, the STG has also fought in war theaters of the 21st century, such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Algeria, and Libya, where it's been used by rebel forces since the Cold War ended. The Sturmgewehr's legacy lives on to this day, with the same name that created a new type of rifle that's become the cornerstone of every single military force worldwide. Operation Long Jump, or Operation Rochelsprung in German, was a plan by the German Third Reich during World War II that could have changed the course of history. Upon learning that British PM Winston Churchill, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, and US President Franklin Roosevelt would all be together in November of 1943 attending the Tehran Conference in Iran, German intelligence crafted a mission with the aim of eliminating or kidnapping the leaders of all three of Germany's greatest adversaries in one dramatic swoop. No other World War II operation would have had a greater impact or significance on the outcome of the war than if Long Jump had succeeded. The Germans were planning to deal a pinpoint and devastating blow to the big three members of the Allied alliance. The three leaders were scheduled to meet together for the first time in Tehran to discuss and agree upon the opening of a second front against Germany. Iran had been chosen as a neutral meeting place, as it had declared itself neutral in the war on September 4, 1939. Significant, however, is that the country's leadership pursued an open pro-German policy despite its declared neutrality. The country had been occupied by British and Soviet troops and was serving as a southern route for military materials that the US had been sending to the USSR. The Allies desperately needed to meet to discuss details of their efforts to counter Hitler. Stalin's USSR had been bearing the heavy weight of the fight on the Eastern Front, so he and Churchill needed to get American assurance of commitment and the details of when and how a second front would be opened. The meeting, codenamed Eureka, would take place at the Soviet embassy from November 28th to December 1st. At first, Stalin had been unwilling to leave Moscow for fear of an air attack, and Roosevelt's disability made traveling challenging. Yet Churchill kept relations between all three active, apart from correspondence and calls, by traveling to meet each of them individually on different occasions. With Churchill's push, Roosevelt did his best to get Stalin to meet them in Cairo. In turn, Stalin suggested Baghdad or Basra. In the end, they settled for Tehran, and the world leaders made the effort to travel despite their reservations. The German plot began to be formed after the Germans learned that Roosevelt and Churchill had met in Casablanca, which made some of their top officials feel like they had missed out on an opportunity to eliminate them both. Halfway through October of 1943, German intelligence cracked a coded message from the US Navy, which told them the time and place of the Tehran conference. It's unclear who exactly designed the plan or suggested it, but it's believed to have been approved by Hitler and tasked to Ernst Kaltenbrunner to mastermind. Lieutenant Colonel, or SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, an unconventional military official known for risky but ambitious military operations, who had planned and executed the rescue of deposed dictator Benito Mussolini in September of 1943, was put in charge of carrying out the mission. Later on, Soviet spy Gevorg Vartanyan would speak on what the Germans planned to do, recalling, quote, "We learned that the Germans were preparing to land a second group of subversives for a terrorist act, the assassination or abduction of the Big Three. The second group was supposed to be led by Skorzeny himself." The occupation armies of the UK and the USSR kept a tight grip on Tehran, with security checkpoints all over the city. Their embassies were well protected within a gated park in the center of the city. The US embassy was only a mile away. Former KGB intelligence officer Vadim Kirpichenko spoke out on Soviet supervision on Iran, saying, quote, "The USSR paid close attention to intelligence in Iran, and not only because the country played a major role in the Middle East during World War II. Its territory was used for espionage and subversive activities against the USSR and for disrupting activities in the most important regions of the Soviet homeland." The USSR was well aware of German attempts to counter them by gathering intel through Iran. Germany had established a spy network in the Iranian capital with at least 400 agents. Opposite to it, the USSR had the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service established in Iran and led by agent Ivan Agayants. It sought to discover and expose foreign spies and hostile undercover acts against the USSR and its interests in Iran. Despite German secrecy, the Soviets were able to uncover Operation Long Jump thanks to their agent Nikolai Kuznetsov. On November 21st, a German radio broadcast announced that the big three enemies of the German state would be going to Tehran. At the time, Agent Kuznetsov, who spoke perfect German, had infiltrated enemy lines, posing as a Wehrmacht lieutenant named Paul Siebert in the Rovno forest of Ukraine. He'd been talking to SS Sturmbannführer Ulrich von Ortel, who knew of the plan for Operation Long Jump. Germans would later claim that no such man existed, leading some to believe that the USSR had invented Ulrich von Ortel. Allegedly, Agent Kuznetsov kept giving Ortel drinks so he would spill the truth. The SS Sturmbannführer then reportedly confessed that they were planning to eliminate Stalin and Churchill in Tehran, and to kidnap Roosevelt so that Germany could force the US into some agreement. Supposedly, those involved in the operation were being trained at a special school in Copenhagen. This version of the plan, and this particular event, can't be confirmed. Further intel was gathered by Gevorg Vartanyan, a 19-year-old spy with a team of 7 intelligence officers. They were the ones to identify the 400 German agents in Iran, all of who were subsequently arrested and questioned by Soviet forces. Vartanian pursued 6 additional German operators who arrived in Qom by parachute, traveled by camel, and had hidden in a villa near Tehran with a significant stockpile of weapons. He had their communications intercepted so they could be recorded and decoded. Through this operative, Vartanian learned that a new group of spies would land in October, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny himself. Vartanian would later state, quote, "We established that they had contacted Berlin by radio and recorded their communications. When we decrypted these radio messages, we learned that the Germans were preparing to land a second group of subversives for a terrorist act, the assassination or abduction of the Big Three. The second group was supposed to be led by Skorzeny himself, who had already visited Tehran to study the situation on the spot. We'd been following all his movements even then." Moscow was alerted of Vartanian and Kuznetsov's discoveries. Stalin shared the information personally with both Roosevelt and Churchill. Of the espionage team's next moves, Vartanian would report, quote, "We arrested all the members of the first group and forced them to make contact with enemy intelligence under our supervision. It was tempting to seize Skorzeny himself, but the Big Three had already arrived in Tehran, and we could not afford the risk. We deliberately gave a radio operator the opportunity to report the failure of the mission, and the Germans decided against sending the main group under Skorzeny to Tehran. In this way, the success of our group in locating the Nazi advance party and our subsequent actions thwarted an attempt to assassinate the Big Three." According to the Soviets, the Germans aborted the mission right then and there. Another version of events holds that the German spies were able to contact Berlin before getting arrested and sent an encrypted message canceling the mission. When Roosevelt arrived in Iran, General Arktiev, head of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs Department of Transportation, briefed Chief of Security Mike Riley on the advancement of their findings. It was agreed that the conference should continue as planned. Roosevelt was transported by car from the American embassy to the Soviet one, and then was offered lodging for him and his team. It had been noted that the Soviet embassy guest quarters were bugged, so that every word of the visiting president could be recorded. In 1984, Gevork Vartanian was granted the Gold Star Medal of the Hero of the Soviet Union for his part in deterring Operation Long Jump. He met with Winston Churchill's granddaughter in 2007, as she thanked him for his service to the Grand Alliance. The USSR was the only one of the 3 major parties to uncover the details of Operation Long Jump, and thereafter had a challenging time convincing the US and UK not only that they had stopped the plot, but that it was real. British and American intelligence officials did not trust or believe Soviet intelligence. When the press tried to report on the operation in the US, Roosevelt's administration had them believe that the story was a far-fetched minor circumstance to be either disbelieved or printed as speculative and unlikely. In the UK, the Joint Intelligence Committee of the War Cabinet concluded that Long Jump was a Soviet invention. Much debate has been carried out about the veracity of the German assassination effort and the Soviet intervention that allegedly saved the 3 Allied leaders. It's been claimed that the 400-agent German network was destroyed before Tehran was chosen as a meeting place, so Germany would not have been able to infiltrate Iran. Once more, it's also been argued that during the conference there were no incidents, despite the fact that over 3,000 Soviet troops were guarding the city, and that both Churchill and Roosevelt traveled in open cars or by foot at least once during their 4-day stay. It's been alleged that the Soviet Union invented Operation Long Jump so that Roosevelt would stay at their embassy to be spied on. Skorzeny himself denied that the plan was ever designed. He stated after the war that the possibility of assassinating Churchill was discussed, but seen as unfeasible and unrelated to the Tehran conference. He also claimed that the primary intelligence source for the mission, Sturmbannführer Ulrich von Ortel, never existed. These contested claims did not stop the story from circulating as true in Russia, where printed and cinematic media have extensively covered the sequence of events surrounding Operation Long Jump. While the truth may never be known for certain, a number of contemporary Western academics have conceded that it is possible that Soviet claims regarding the situation were completely accurate. On January 1st, 1945, the Allied air forces welcomed the new year with an unexpected low-level attack from the Luftwaffe. Named Operation Baseplate, or Operation Bodenplatte, the German attack launched 850 fighters and bombers against 17 Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The goal of Baseplate was to achieve air superiority by taking advantage of sleeping and hungover Allied soldiers. The fighters sought to destroy or critically damage as many runways, hangars, and aircraft as possible. The operation was initially planned for mid-December 1944, but bad weather delayed it several times until January 1st, 1945. Secrecy for Operation Baseplate was so tight that not all German officers were informed of the plan. This terrible mismanagement ultimately led to one of the most remarkable self-inflicted blunders of World War II, when the Germans mistakenly shot down fighters from over 25% of their own air units. Of the event, General de Jagdflieger Adolf Galland would say, quote, "We sacrificed our last substance." Throughout 1944, the German air forces had grown increasingly desperate. After 5 years of war, they had lost most of their skilled pilots and ran out of safe areas to train their new recruits. The British had also begun building the Spitfire Mark IX, the first Allied plane with superiority over the German Focke-Wulf FW-190. By the end of the year, inadequately trained pilots with zero testing experience were drilling the Luftwaffe ranks. It was the beginning of the end, and Luftwaffe knew it. Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring assigned General Major Dietrich Peltz as the leader of Operation Bodenplatte. In English, Bodenplatte translates to baseplate or floorboard. The Germans wanted to penetrate the Allies' air forces' foundation to destroy their growing base of power in Europe. General Major Peltz assigned almost 1,000 German aircraft to attack Allied airfields in the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, which was considered the most popular and feared aircraft in history, would be used for the mission, along with the dreaded Focke-Wulf FW-190A and 190D. Initially, Operation Baseplate was supposed to be executed in early December, in support of Hitler's Battle of the Bulge. However, bad weather kept postponing it. On the few days with clear skies, the airspace was taken by Allied fighters. By New Year's Eve, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 600 aircraft and 350 pilots. Operation Baseplate had to be executed before they lost any more. General Major Peltz knew a surprise attack on New Year's Day was their only chance at victory. This type of operation called for strict radio silence and secrecy to surprise the Allied forces on the ground. At night, Peltz coded a go signal to fighter bases across northern Germany. The great blow was scheduled for the next morning. On the first morning of 1945, at around 9:20 a.m., an ominous roar echoed over the Low Countries. The Allies had been launching massive plane raids for years, but for the first time in some time, these were heading towards them. 1,000 German fighters crossed the lines at only 150 feet off the ground. It was a surprise attack that caught the British and Americans off guard. Allied intelligence failed to detect the German operation. In recovered ultra-decrypted transcripts, there are only rare indications of what was happening on the other side of the front. On December 4th, 1944, Ultra-intelligence noticed that the Germans had ordered stockpiling for navigational aids, like flares and smoke bombs. But the Allies made no written observations of this information. Allied intelligence concluded that the stockpiling was for a ground support mission, not an interception operation. This was reasonable, but no indications of possible ground targets were given. Airman Desmond Shepard was an armorer stationed in the Netherlands during the attack. He recalled, quote, "The first hours of 1945 were spent letting in the new year, wishing each other all the best and having a few beers. After breakfast, I was crossing the runway, going toward the armory. At that moment, I heard gunfire. Looking up the runway, I saw what looked like an Me-262 jet go streaking above my head. This was closely followed by several FW-190s, and coming in the other direction were several Me-109s. I threw myself down onto the grass at the side of the runway. But the Allies weren't as hungover as the Germans expected them to be. Many of the bases had already launched morning missions, and some of them had returned by the time the Germans arrived. Flight Lieutenant R.C. Smith had aborted his dawn flight that morning because of fuel issues. He arrived at his Eindhoven base when he noticed a German Jagdgeschwader 3 arrive with several other aircraft. Smith plunged to the attack, where he shot down a Messerschmitt and attacked 9 others before running out of ammunition. Another flight lieutenant, Peter Wilson, was on his first mission as leader of the 438th Squadron when he was attacked by the Germans. His wingman, Officer Ross Keller, had barely gotten off the ground when Nazis shot him down. The Jagdgeschwader 3 unit destroyed almost 30 Allied planes that morning, damaged another 30, and lost 30 of their own. If the mission had gone as well for the German fighters as it did for the Jagdgeschwader 3, Bodenplatte would have been a victory. In contrast to the New Year's festivities on the Allied side, any celebration, and especially any alcohol consumption, was prohibited for the Luftwaffe. The night before the attack, the young German pilots went to bed early. Ground crews even worked all night to prepare for the attack. German pilot Sergeant Werner Molge, who was only 19 when Operation Baseplate occurred, recalled arriving at his base on that day, quote, "When we turned in at the field, a fantastic sight spread out in front of our eyes. The aircraft of all the Staffeln had been taxied from their dispersals by the ground crews and were lined up at the field as if for parade inspection. 50 FW-190 D9s in the last light of the moon." At the Melsburg airfield northeast of Brussels, 35 British Royal Air Force planes were destroyed. A further 9 were severely damaged. Many of the battles in Operation Baseplate had similar results, hurting the Allies, but devastating the already weak Luftwaffe. Corporal Jeffrey Kook, a radar technician in charge of the lighthouse at Belcheren Island, remembered being caught off guard by, quote, "hordes of German planes flying towards the Belgian coast. They passed on both sides, and many were nearer to the ground than my perch. I shall always remember that grandstand view of the last major effort of the Luftwaffe." The degree of secrecy prioritized in the development and implementation of Operation Baseplate ultimately hampered its success. In preparation for the mission, some of the younger pilots were given maps without their bases or flight paths on them, in case they fell into Allied hands. Most pilots weren't even notified that many of their own anti-air batteries would be active and under them on January 1st. Many assumed they were on a mass reconnaissance mission by the time they followed their commanders into battle. This blend of circumstances ultimately led to the most significant blow to Operation Baseplate. During the battle, many air units suffered friendly fire casualties from the anti-aircraft artillery. The German ground and naval forces could not believe that the Luftwaffe was mounting an effort of this scale. Some batteries, such as the ones guarding V-2 missile launch sites around The Hague, fired upon their own aircraft. German Squadrons 27 and 54 began Operation Baseplate with 43 planes. 7 of them were lost to friendly fire before ever reaching the target. By the end of the battle, they had lost almost half their aircraft, and 17 pilots were killed or captured. It's estimated that up to 25% of the Luftwaffe's losses on January 1st, 1945 were from friendly fire. Sergeant Erich Heider, flying a Pathfinder in the Luftwaffe, was forced to take evasive action near the Isel River. He described, quote, "This was German, our own flak. Only shouts of anger were our answer. What a mess." And this following several weeks of preparation. The operational plan was no good. Operation Baseplate was far from a long-term success. The German pilots' experience, or lack thereof, was evident. The Allies were able to quickly mount their defenses and began fighting the enemy in the air. American pilots flying P-51 Mustangs showed off that day in the airfields and downed dozens upon dozens of German aircraft. The post-battle analysis concluded that only 1/3 of the Luftwaffe's 34 air combat groups made attacks on time, and with a surprise element. the operation failed to achieve the desired air superiority the Luftwaffe aimed for. In fact, Operation Baseplate was the last significant assault the Luftwaffe was capable of. World War II ended 4 months later. The Allies suffered very minor losses. Since they were well supplied in the rest of Europe, they quickly replaced almost all of their lost aircraft. Overall, it's estimated that Operation Bodenplatte destroyed 305 Allied aircraft and damaged another 190. Still, many believe the number to be much higher. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, lost about 280 aircraft and had over 140 pilot casualties. Almost 100 of them were captured by the Allies. Most of the losses consisted of new pilots. Still, some of the casualties included experienced officers and veteran flyers. This left Germany's defense with crippled resources, lots of inexperienced pilots, weaker than ever, and incapable of mounting any major attack again. Germany's skies were quickly lost as the Western and Eastern fronts collapsed into Berlin. The Luftwaffe lost another 200 pilots during the last 6 weeks of the war.